Hello guys, and welcome to episode 3 of Planet ZOOkeeper. So in this episode we're going to be talking about zoo maps and layouts, something that a lot of people do seem to have problems with, and it can be quite a confusing thing to do and kind of a bit higgledy-piggledy all over the place as you're kind of building throughout a specific zoo. So I am hopefully going to be able to enlighten you a little bit in how to make your zoo layouts seem a bit more realistic and make sure you include everything you need to know. So if you have been struggling with your layouts, hopefully this will be the video for you. So in the previous 2 episodes we have covered down here the fencing in episode 1, and then in last episode we covered planting down here. So if you want to check them out, then I'll have a link to the playlist for Planet ZOOkeeper in the description, so have a look at that if you wish. So yeah, this week we're going to focus on maps, layouts, all that sort of thing. If you're not already a member of my Discord, then I actually put a vote to decide what the next episode would be, and this was the winner by a clear margin, so this is the one I'm going to do. So I'll probably be doing that again, so if you're interested in being part of the selection process for the next episode, I'll cover everything eventually, but I thought it would be nice to just give people on my Discord the chance to request what they would like to see in sort of the order that they would like to see stuff. So yeah, if you would like to take part in that, then join the Discord and the link will be in the description. So zoo layouts and maps. So there is a lot of different elements to this that I'll be kind of covering it in 2 different sort of topics. So in the first half we're going to talk about actual enclosures and placement and that sort of thing, and then in the second part down here we have this intriguing little thing which I hope will work nicely for sort of more general layouts and that sort of thing. So obviously, as I say in every episode, all this stuff is things that I've picked up from places I've visited, where I've worked at as a zookeeper, which I am, and just other things that I've seen, read about, all that sort of thing. So they're not going to be everything. I might not cover everything in this, but I'm trying to do my best to cover everything that I can think of. But there will always be exceptions to the rules, so you can take everything on board, but remember that there's no sort of set in stone way of doing things, of course. So right, firstly, so we're going to talk about enclosures. So the first thing we're going to talk about is groupings of enclosures. So how do we group different enclosures within the zoo? So one of the first ones, and one of the most common, is by geography, so geographic groupings. So this might be sort of various different sizes, so you might say by continent, we might say specific countries, certain regions in a certain area. You may have sort of local wildlife areas, so things like an Australian section in an Australian zoo, so for native species, that sort of thing. Things like national parks, so any of those things that are just grouped by geography rather than any other aspects. So in here, ignoring the smelly food, we've got just a few different African species. Quite a loose geographic theme there, but a very valid one. So that is one of the main ones, one of the really important ones, and a fairly easy one to do. Next we have got taxonomic. So this refers to the scientific classification of animals. So it's another fairly common one that zoos will use to group their animals in certain areas. So this could be fairly wide taxonomic groupings or very specific. So quite wide ones, we might have fish, reptiles, amphibians, that sort of thing, hoof stock. fairly wide-ranging, encompassing a lot of different species, or we might have more specific things, so like big cats, things like that, which we have got here. So again, fairly easy one in some respects for certain different taxa, depending on what we've got in the game. But big cats is quite a nice, easy one to do, and a fairly common one that you still see in quite a lot of zoos will have big cat areas, that sort of thing. Or you may even have things like carnivores, so again quite a wide one, but a fairly common one. You might have a carnivorous area, or combining the two. So a lot of these can be combined with each other, so you might have carnivores from Africa, and that is your grouping. Next we'll move to biome. So again, another popular one, again maybe used alongside any of the other different types, so things like the geography, so you might have certain areas that are linked to a specific biome, but also quite a valid one in itself, things like polar regions or tundra sort of areas, general desert areas not defined by any specific location, tropical houses, things like that. Again, can be very specific or quite broad. So here we've just got, is it all of the Arctic? I think it is. Yeah, this is all the Arctic DLC animals, so obviously a really good one for specific biomes or that sort of thing. We've got all tundra species there. Next we have got mixed, or random. So often we will have layouts that aren't completely one method, so you won't just have one whole zoo, everything is strictly in certain areas defined on biomes or taxonomy, like that sort of thing. You'll often have different areas that are kind of mixed groupings. So you might have one area that's very much an African area, then you might still have a desert house, and then you might have an aquarium that's just fish in it, obviously, things like that. So yeah, it can be very much mixed in a lot of zoos. So random ones you might get more in smaller collections where they have maybe a couple of themed areas but not as much. Whereas in the larger zoos where you've got a lot of animals, you might have a bit more theming, maybe more effort to try and make certain areas within the zoo, and therefore group things a little bit more. So we've just got a random selection of species here. We've got a lemur, a flamingo, a kangaroo, and the bongo is making an appearance as in every episode. So yeah, just random animals thrown together, which there's not really any issues with that. If you want to put random animals together, it's fine. People will still enjoy it. The only issue you may find is that things like the theming might be a bit more difficult. Education sometimes is better when you group animals in certain groups for whatever reason. So yeah, still valid, but maybe not as worthwhile potentially in some respects as some of the other groupings. So next we'll move on to just a few random considerations that you might have for where you place habitats, that sort of thing, and placing enclosures, so, and the animals that will go in them. So terrain is quite an important one. So it can play a role in where enclosures are, and where other features within the zoo are actually placed as well. So for animals, things like hilly areas might be more suited to kind of mountainous species, things like that, as evidenced by this llama. I think I put a llama in here. Yeah, I did. A little llama. So yeah, things like that. You might have a big hill in your zoo and you think, okay, I'll put some species that are more suited to that terrain in there. You also, again, might have actual buildings that are influenced by this. So if you have really large buildings, potentially you're probably not going to build them into the side of a hill. You'll put them on flatter ground, things like that. So or you'll design them appropriately or landscape them, that sort of thing. So they are just, and that's another consideration to take into account there with terrain. Climate is another one, so obviously it might have an impact on the species you actually choose for your zoo. So if your zoo is based in a colder climate, then you may want to go for more cold suited species, or vice versa. You may want animals that are suited to warmer climates, if your zoo is situated wherever you've decided it's situated in a warmer climate. Again, might also influence the infrastructure and buildings and things that you have, designs and types of actual enclosures. So if your zoo is in a cold climate, you might want a lot more indoor space for visitors, indoor enclosures, things like that. And then on the flip side of that, if you're in a really hot place, you might want more outdoor spaces, even things like reptiles and things that are a bit more sensitive. Maybe you'll have actual outdoor enclosures for them, where sometimes you might find them more strictly indoors if they're in a slightly colder climate. So climate is a consideration depending on where you're putting your zoo, where it is on the map. And then lastly, availability. So this is more to do just with the species themselves, so things that are more or less common. So for example, we've got the giant panda in here, so quite a rare one in zoos around the world because of the availability. Obviously quite rare, quite specialised, so things like that will be less likely if you're building a fairly small zoo, whereas things like lemurs that are readily available, are quite common, will be quite prevalent in a lot of small zoos. So most zoos will have some sort of lemur, I would say, because they're fairly easy to keep. They're quite small, and yeah, they breed quite readily, and they're readily available. Things like elephants, hippos, bigger animals potentially that need very heavy duty enclosures and expensive enclosures maybe are again less suited to your smaller zoos. So next we'll move on to actual layouts of enclosures, so just kind of rough ways that you might group enclosures in terms of actual layout. So firstly, main and satellite. So this is basically saying that you'll have a main large sort of very popular species in a kind of central enclosure here in the red enclosure, and then around it you'll have other different enclosures that kind of support that one. So you might have some sort of medium-sized animal here, and then a few smaller enclosures just dotted around the edge. It's quite a popular method in especially larger zoos where they have quite a variety of different species, and these kind of smaller ones on the outside may be things like birds, reptiles, small mammals, things like that. It's quite nice in terms of it allows for a lot of variety in your species and things like that, and it does work well if you want to showcase certain geography, certain areas or certain biomes. So if you had an African area, maybe you have elephants in here, some sort of antelope or something in this one, and then some birds and reptiles and things like that, maybe a fish tank or something in these smaller ones. So just highlighting certain geographic areas or biomes is quite a nice one for the variety. Next we move to multiple large and small, so I'll kind of do these together. So multiple large, some zoos, especially larger zoos obviously, will have multiple large enclosures grouped together, so you might have a lot of kind of big ticket animals in your larger zoos, and you might want to showcase them all together, especially if you're again going for geographic groupings or biomes, things like that. So you might have elephants, giraffes and rhinos, and you want them all kind of together. You might still have some dotted around the edge, but you will still have some larger ones all together. And then on the other side of that, multiple small and maybe medium too. So this one may be more in small collections, so where you've got fewer large animals and generally less space in your zoo. you might have smaller animals that take the kind of centre stage, and these ones just dotted around with various other smaller enclosures around. Then we move to random. So a lot of zoos won't necessarily follow a pattern, so they might just fit enclosures in wherever they can. Especially if a zoo is constantly developing, they might have one area they want to redevelop, and they will put whatever they can in the space they've got with the money that they've got. So again, often smaller zoos may be more random, so they might have a sort of less theming, and they'll probably have less space to group enclosures together. And then they also might be tighter on funds, so when it comes to actually building certain areas, they might not be able to redevelop this space to do all these different things. They might only be able to redevelop that, so they'll just put whatever they can in, again, the space that they've got. You may also come into this if you're kind of using some sort of backstory, that you've got an old zoo that is kind of redeveloping and there was no previous plan there for that one. Then you might kind of follow the pattern of there not being any theme specifically, but in general bigger zoos will probably have a bit more structure to them. Smaller zoos maybe a little less, but there's again always exceptions, so you can kind of do whatever you want, but they're just a few kind of rough guidelines there. And then finally, just a little mention for external, which is a bit of a strange one. Not that common, but there are a few that do exist. I've seen a couple. So this might be an enclosure that's kind of on the border, so say this is your perimeter of the zoo boundary, and then this is the inside of the zoo, that's outside the zoo. You might have an actual enclosure that's kind of on the boundary. It's quite an unusual one, but like I say, I have seen it before. So obviously a big factor in that is the security. Can you be sure that people can't access it, animals definitely won't get out, all that sort of thing, but it can be quite an impressive thing to see, especially if you're kind of queuing up and you can see animals already, or to actually draw people in if they're just walking past, if it's in a city and you kind of walk past and you see these animals. So yeah, very impressive if it's done safely and correctly. You can also consider things that are visible from outside the zoo but not sticking out. So this enclosure here, or potentially that if it's right next to the zoo. Can people see that from outside the zoo without actually going in? This might also kind of excite guests as they're coming in and attract people as they're going past. They might see some monkey in a tree from outside the zoo and think, oh, I must go to the zoo one day. So that's a couple of things that you might consider too in your zoos when you're building. So next we shall move to a little mention on grouping. So as I said before, in terms of arranging enclosures, you'll want to take into account your groupings. So main and satellite, again, good for highlighting biomes and geographic areas. Multiple, small or big are quite good for taxonomic, so where animals require have similar requirements. So certain reptiles, or if you have a big cat area, they might have similar kind of size requirements or husbandry requirements, that sort of thing. And then random ones for random groupings is quite a good one, but again, nothing is set in stone. You can kind of be quite flexible, but these are just a few of the methods that zoos will use to group their enclosures. Now, before we move on to the last bit, we've just got one more little bit to go through, and that is the types of enclosures. So we'll just briefly go through these. Obviously they're fairly self-explanatory, a lot of them, but just to make sure. I can't even remember what this is. What is this? Oh, tortoises, okay. I thought there was something dead in the corner. So, the first type we'll go through is terrestrial. So this is probably going to be your most common in your zoo. Just purely land-based enclosure with fairly normal fencing probably. Potentially covered over depending on the species, but often just open air enclosure. So yeah, most likely to be your main type of enclosure, unless you have a very specialised collection that focuses on birds and you have a lot of aviaries or specific aquatics, that sort of thing. Next, speaking of aquatics, we've got aquatic and semi-aquatic. So some of the really popular zoo species fit into this category, so things like otters, sea lions, hippos, crocodiles, all of those, and many more. Some of them in the game, some of them not yet. Hopefully we'll get some more. So this will be either a mixture of land and water for the semi-aquatic, or just purely water for the aquatic, maybe including underwater viewing as well. Aquatic ones can be good in the satellite enclosures, so those smaller ones, and they might often be grouped together, so in aquariums, things like that. Next, aviary. So I had to rebuild this for, I was going to copy it over and I had to rebuild it, so another fairly simple aviary with the same peafowl inside. So we touched on it in the fencing episode, so if you haven't seen that, go check that one out. But it's a really good way of making your zoos look realistic, because aviaries and zoos are very common. They do take a lot of effort to make, but they can be really worthwhile. Again, good to use for the satellite enclosures, the smaller or medium enclosures dotted around your kind of big sort of ABC species, your elephants, zebras, things like that. But you might want to make really big kind of focus aviaries that are massive walk-through things with flamingos and all sorts of other different species in them. So you can be quite flexible with them, but they're a good one if you can be bothered to try and make them. Which you may or may not want to, which is understandable because they take a lot of work. Next, we've got indoor. So it's very common for zoos to have some sort of indoor enclosures or buildings, that sort of thing, for animals, but not necessarily loads of them. They'll probably vary in size and frequency as well, depending on some of the factors we talked about earlier, climate, things like that. And often they'll be grouped smaller enclosures together, so reptiles, amphibians, invertebrates, fish. You'll have an indoor building that houses all those different enclosures. You might have climate controlled buildings, so you might have tropical houses or kind of cool houses, polar region houses like penguin house, that sort of thing. You might have other taxonomic sort of indoor houses, so you might have a cat house which has the indoor viewing for lots of different cats or lots of different primates in a primate house, that sort of thing. And then also take into account obviously the fact that even your outdoor enclosures may have indoor areas or sort of public viewing areas, things like that, and obviously they will have houses associated with them as well, but we won't go too much into actual enclosure design and things because we'll cover that in another episode at some point. And then finally, a small mention for the implied enclosure. We've got a lovely rare species in here, the question mark. So obviously there's not a type of enclosure the same as them, but it is a really important one and a really useful one to make your zoos look much more realistic, especially a lot of those smaller enclosures for small species, things like meerkats, otters, all those sorts of things, your aviaries, your aquatic animals, things that we don't really have yet that are very common in zoos. So they can really make your zoo look more realistic. They also add a lot more variety to your zoo than just having your big enclosures, big terrestrial enclosures with your big animals like your elephants and all those sorts of things. So yeah, a really good one if you can bear to create an enclosure that's not going to have anything in it, then it's a really good one. And there's loads of different things you can do. Obviously scale might be tricky, and it might test your patience a little bit, but if you can get it right, it really does help, I think. So that is it for the enclosures section of the video. So now we'll talk about infrastructure and layouts. So hopefully this is going to work. I spent quite a lot of time trying to prep this, and I hope it will work properly how I'd like it to. So what we've got here is a map that I've designed, just a very rough map of all the different things that you'll have in your zoo, ideally. So I'm going to talk through everything, not in any particular order, but we've got a few different things to just talk about. We won't go into like massive detail because a lot of them are fairly self-explanatory, but just to kind of show you what your map might end up looking like in terms of all the different things you have on there. So the first thing we're going to do quickly, if I can remember which one is which, is enclosures. So here we go, enclosures. Right, so here, obviously, as we've said many times already, a massive part of your zoo, really important. They'll probably cover a massive area of your zoo because obviously the animals are the main part, the main attraction. Though you might have a lot of variety within these, which again we'll go through in enclosure design and stuff in another episode. But you might have sort of standalone ones that are kind of out on their own. You might have very connected ones, things that are actually joined, all sorts of different things you can do with your enclosures. Again, looking at our groupings, so we might say that these are all different zones here. We might have an Asia zone, an African zone, a kind of polar region zone, maybe a desert zone with a desert house here, lots of small enclosures all in one house, and then a few just random ones here. I would say steer clear from that kind of rigidity and grids if possible. Have it as free flowing as you can in terms of where things are, sizes, all that sort of thing, because that makes it look more realistic. Most zoos aren't built on grids in real life, if any. I'm not sure. There might be some, but I don't know of any. So yeah, try and steer clear of that if you can. But yeah, that is your one of your main ones, obviously, your enclosures. So next we shall look at this one, main roads and paths. Oh, there we go. Got to make sure it lines up right, otherwise it won't work. So main roads and paths. So often zoos, especially large zoos, will have a kind of main route that you follow around the zoo that you can kind of see the majority of things, or just that they suggest on the map. This is the main route you should take, that kind of thing. You will also probably be needing these main routes, like kind of wide paths or roads, for vehicles to be able to get around the site as well. Even in small zoos, obviously it's quite important that vehicles can get around if they need to, in case of emergencies, or even just moving things from A to B, that sort of thing. You might also have other additional main paths and roads that join certain areas or join up to specific facilities that you have within your zoo. So we've got, say, an extra one here that goes through that area there, through the kind of centre. Next we shall talk about small roads and paths. If I can click it. There we go. So small roads and paths. So as well as all your main ones, you're obviously going to have quite a lot of extra additional paths and maybe some other roads and things as well. You'll want people to be able to see maybe different parts of enclosures, different viewpoints, to be able to access certain facilities that you have that are kind of slightly off the main roads, maybe to loop round enclosures like down here. And you maybe want them to be a lot thinner, maybe certain little trails or nature trails, things like that. And you might also have other roads that are more access roads for enclosures or for sort of back of house buildings and things like that. Next we shall move to staff facilities. So, staff facilities, obviously a really important one for your zoos, especially the larger zoos will have quite a lot of staff and they need to all be able to do their job effectively, and this will allow them to do so. So there's loads of different types of staff facility that you'll probably have in your zoo. So offices will be quite an important one. A lot of zoos will have quite a lot of office, or bigger zoos will have a lot of office staff. Even the smaller zoos will need some sort of offices, most likely, to be able to do a lot of the admin and things like that. You might have warehouses and storage yards, buildings to store equipment potentially, or just other stock, say for gift shops and things. You might have warehouses, especially in the big zoos, obviously, where they stock a lot of stuff. You might have areas where vehicles are stored when not in use, so maybe bigger sort of diggers or dumper trucks or things like that. You might have waste disposal areas where all the waste from animals can go, or where you store all public waste from all the bins that are collected, go to a certain area where you have all your waste disposal and stuff. So all really important parts of the zoo that you ideally won't leave out because it will help them look realistic. Also staff rooms as well. They might be, all these things might be dotted around the map, especially if it's a large zoo. If it's a smaller zoo, they might be more compact. If they have less staff, maybe one staff room or two. If it's a bigger zoo, then you might have multiple different teams looking after different animals, so you might have staff rooms just dotted about different areas, and then certain main yard areas dotted about too. So kind of the size and number of facilities should be reflected in your map, depending on the actual size of the place. As well as staff facilities, obviously very important is the guest facilities. So again, loads of different types of these, and a really massive part of the zoo layout and the design of the zoo. So things like your entrance, so in this zoo we're saying this is the entrance building here. Gift shops, which may be part of big buildings, or you might have little stands, a couple of little stands dotted about too. We've got things like play areas, quite an important one, quite a common one in zoos. Might have multiple play areas depending on the size of the zoo, dotted around, maybe themed to different areas or certain species in an area. Toilets, really important one again. And then obviously food and drink areas too. And you might also have things like arenas or demonstration show sort of areas, depending if you feel like that's something you'd like to have in your zoo. So all of these are likely to be dotted around the whole map for the guests' convenience. So things like toilets, you don't want to have your only toilet block here, and this is the size of your zoo. You might want a toilet block here, 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 and maybe in the gift shop as well, or in the entrance building, sorry. So yeah, again, all your facilities should be sort of dotted around in different areas for the convenience, and again, sizes and number of these facilities will depend on the size of your zoo. Next, we shall move to this one. Transport. Has to be a little bit higher, this one. So, not all zoos will have transport within them. Obviously, more likely in larger zoos, possibly for guests to be able to get around a larger site. Plus also the fact that they are more likely to be able to cover the costs of having these transport within them if they are a larger zoo. Though some smaller places will have little, like, you know, maybe little train that goes around, things like that, but yeah, it's not necessarily going to be something that you'll have, but a lot of zoos do have them. So we have a variety of them in the game itself, in terms of the boats, we have the monorail, all those different things. So the area that they cover might vary quite a lot. So some might cover large areas or even the whole site. You might have some sort of monorail with multiple stations that goes all the way around, following almost the main path. You might have some around specific enclosures, so or specific areas. So we've just in here we've just got one that loops around here, so covering a few of these enclosures in these areas here. Or you might have them zoned, themed to certain zones. So if we had one around here, if this was our Africa zone, we might have some sort of ride that goes around there, maybe like an African Jeep safari type thing. So yeah, there's a few different ways that you might have them in your zoo and where they might be placed. Then another very, very important one, which is this one, yes, fillers. Very, very important. So the map's building now. So fillers. Obviously, within your zoo, you're likely to have some free space. Not every single little bit is going to be used, and it's quite nice to be able to have some free space in your zoo. More so probably going to be in large zoos where they can afford not to use every little bit of space, but potentially in your smaller zoos as well you might have other areas there too that aren't used. So these areas can really help to make your zoos more aesthetically pleasing if you do them nicely or if you take care of them. So you might want to fill gaps with planted areas represented by these trees here. You might have trees or forested areas or just planted up areas. We might have plazas or courtyards. So we've got, I don't think one of them has come up enough. There it is. It's my fault. There you go. So we've got one here and one here. So they're plazas or courtyard areas. You might have water features or actual water sort of bodies. So we've got a couple over here and here. And then just random things as well, so maybe things like art, statues, those sorts of things, or potentially signage, interpretation, education type things. Or you might just have more bare areas, just wild areas that aren't really maintained, but just, you know, provide maybe a nature area, just a sort of meadow, wildflower meadow, or just an area that's left a bit more untouched. So yes, it's really important to have these and not neglect these sort of free spaces within your zoo. But you don't have to be OTT with them. You can do whatever you want with them, really. Now, the last three aren't necessary, but they can be quite useful potentially and help with the realism, and it really just depends on how much detail you want to go into in terms of your whole map. So these ones are kind of more not within your actual zoo. So the first one we're going to look at is the perimeter. If I can place it correctly, there we go. So your perimeter is a really important part of the zoo. It keeps people out and keeps animals in if they were to somehow get out of their enclosure. So it basically just defines the actual outer barriers, the outer perimeter boundary of the zoo. Often it will be some sort of tall fence and maybe a tall chain link fence, but you might have, depending on where where your zoo is or that kind of thing, your backstory, any of that, it might be something different, but just some sort of tall fence around the edge that is very well defined. So it might be kind of a mixture of on and off show, so maybe this part is quite visible from these paths, but you might have some areas around the back here where you can't actually see it as the path goes in front of these enclosures and things. You can put it in potentially at the start or at the end if you want to put it in at all. It mainly just depends on whether you'd like to be restricted or not. So potentially you want a challenge, you might just build a perimeter fence and then start building within that, and it maybe will help you sort of make you feel inspired to actually build and make things fit where you want them and all that sort of thing, yeah, potentially will help your creativity. Potentially you might just feel very restricted and not like it, but potentially you could do it at the end, so you might just build organically from wherever you want, and once you're finished you might say, right, this is where I'm going to put my boundary now, and then just fill in all the gaps between your perimeter and what you've built inside. It kind of helps to finish your zoo off and kind of define it better in the map, but obviously again it's not necessary because it's not built in any specific area. It's kind of got its own perimeter in terms of like this hedgerow around here or the trees, but you might want to, yeah, just kind of make it a bit more defined. Next we move on to this grey blob here, which is the car park. Is that in? Yes. Oh, there we go. So, car park. Obviously massively important for zoos, or most zoos. Obviously there might be some that are not necessarily dependent on public transport, but will have a lot, some form of public transport, but car park's very important. So again, depends if you want to bother with it, because obviously it's external to your zoo, it's beyond the entrance, so it's completely up to you whether you'd like to do it or not. But there's a lot of really nice looking ones that I've seen people make that really realistic and really add to that kind of build up there at the entrance, having your car park, and you obviously probably want to include your access, your join between the car park and the entrance, and it can be something that really adds to that realism, really sort of makes it look real, sparks that kind of excitement as you walk through from the car park to the entrance. So they will obviously vary a lot in size depending on the size of your zoo, and you can kind of look at Google Maps for different zoos and see what size their car parks are and what they look like, but there's a lot of different styles. You might have grass ones, you might have concrete ones, asphalt ones, you might just have gravel car park, you might have a mixture of different bits, different areas, or even like overflow areas that are just grass, like that sort of thing. So all different types of car parks, and there's quite a few things on the workshop. I'm sure there must be actual car parks on the workshop that you can add in to your with your own entrance and things, but there's definitely a lot of elements that you would find within a car park on the workshop, signs and all sorts of bits on the floor markings, stuff like that. So yeah, that's definitely one that you could include there for your realism. And then last but not least, possibly, you can see it's a big one, surroundings. So this is a curveball, again, not necessarily one that you'll want to do, but if you really wanted to cement your zoo within a landscape, within a map, you might want to do some of the surroundings. I know I've seen some people do surroundings or making things that are kind of a backdrop, so sort of tall office buildings or things in the background, that sort of thing. So it is something that you could do to make your zoo a bit more realistic looking from the inside, from like first person view, as you're walking around. If you did want some sort of city skyline in the background, then that would be a cool thing to do, and make your zoo look more realistic from the inside. And there's a few different components that you could do. So you might just have like fields and things, you might have planting, forests, that sort of thing, buildings, as I've said, you might have water, you might have some sort of river that runs along the front of your zoo, along the entrance, that sort of thing. So just anything that would make it look like it's an actual map. Again, a lot of extra effort and work, but it's completely up to you. If you'd like to do it, then it's kind of a cool one that you can do to help, just like I say, cement your zoo in the landscape. You might have a country zoo, you might have kind of city zoo, you might have kind of rural or urban kind of mixture. You might want to put houses in that border the zoo, that sort of thing. So you can let your imagination run wild with that one, if you wish. So that is our finished map. Obviously enclosures and all these buildings very rough, just represented by art shapes. So all these this enclosure would probably be this kind of shape, and that these two would be different shapes and mixed together, like all those sorts of things. But this is just a kind of rough guide on how to build a map. So this is just completely random. I just place things randomly and group them all together, and this is what I've come up with. So yeah, hopefully you have found this useful. I will quickly, as I always do, pop into my Whipsnade Zoo recreation, even though it's not finished, so I can't show you a full map, but I'll just show you briefly what I have got so far and a few of the different things we talked about in this. So I will see you in a second for that bit. Okay guys, so we are back in my Whipsnade Zoo recreation to have a look in here for this week's topic, which is the maps. So we've got kind of an overall view here. So this is just to show the general kind of layout. So obviously we've got all random shapes of enclosures, different sizes. This is all kind of one big one here. We've got smaller ones around here, some very small ones here. We've got some kind of more indoory buildings dotted about. We've got things like a cafe here, down here. We've got food place here, so you can see they're kind of spread out. We have the kind of main route around the zoo that goes all the way around here. You can kind of see it's big sort of road. Whipsnade's strange in that it's kind of drive in with your car and drive around it, but it's not a safari park, except there is one drive-through area with deer in it, so it's kind of a weird mixture. But there is a kind of main route that you follow, that cars follow all the way around, and then there are a few other roads that are kind of access roads. We've got various paths and things that cut through different places, go around enclosures, all that sort of thing. Then we have got things like implied enclosures. So down here we've got our meerkats in that little area there next to the Red River hogs, and the lions over here, and the oryx there, and we've got, let's see if I can find it down here. So we've got this lake area that's all kind of implied, there's no birds on it, waterfowl on it, and the aviary here, which is all implied again as well. So things like this just make it look a lot more real, because they are real. But obviously if you were to make things like this, it would look real. And then taking a look at just the filler areas as well again. So if we zoom out here and we hop over this direction here, so just this area here, this big triangle here, is just all trees, just all planted with trees. There's no animals in it. And then we've got these kind of areas here in between the giraffes there, the cranes over here, just planted up with a few little trees and paths. We've got the hunting dogs here, but then behind that we've got this big area of bluebell woodland. That's again just a filler. It's not an enclosure, it's not any sort of guest area or staff facility, anything like that. It's purely a gap between some enclosures, but it's a very important gap. It's very important for nature and things like that. So yeah, just a couple of things in here. I didn't want to be in here for long, but just to show a rough look at a real map within Planet Zoo. I'm not even going to be able to get all my my zoo in here. I'm cutting off big chunks of it, but we've got kind of Africa area in this area kind of here. We've got an Asia area over here. We've got the Europe area, which is around here, which is a lot of it I've cut off, but this is the Europe area, including the bison here. That's that bit. And then we've got what we call base camp, which is all the sort of bit in the middle that doesn't really fit in with any of these areas, even though they are obviously from these areas, doesn't really fit in. So things like otters, we've got chimps and lemurs in there, which are obviously African, but they are not within this area here in the zoo, the Africa area. They are down here. So yeah, a few different things to think about in your zoos. I hope this has been a useful episode. I know, as I said, something that a lot of people have asked for and have struggled with in terms of what they're doing. So I really hope it has been useful. I hope I haven't missed anything out, and I hope it's been clear. So if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already to the channel for up-to-date episodes of this series, Planet Zookeeper, as well as my Whipsnade Zoo recreation, which I've done videos for, and other different sort of random tutorials or random builds, things like that. Comment on any thoughts that you have, any questions if you have any questions, and of course if you would like, you can also join the Discord, as I said earlier. You can ask any questions, tell me thoughts, anything like that, and as I said earlier, you can also vote for the next topic we will cover in the series. So yeah, hopefully you will join in there and get involved. It would be nice to see some more people in there. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.